What if the most controversial royal story of the modern era wasn't driven by love, or hate, or even chance? What if it was shaped by silence? Not the comforting kind, not the respectful kind, but the kind that lingers, the kind that watches, the kind that never corrects the record, even when the record spirals out of control. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the question no one ever asks out loud. When a woman marries into one of the most scrutinized institutions on earth, who decides what the institution already knows? And who decides what the public is never supposed to hear? Because according to allegations that refuse to disappear, whispered, denied, recycled, and reshaped over years, this story may not begin with a royal wedding. It may begin with a file, a quiet file, a sealed file, a file that, if it ever existed, was never meant to be seen. And the most unsettling part? The only reason people keep talking about it is because the people who could shut it down never do. Now, let's be very clear from the start. What you're about to hear is not a statement of fact. It's not a medical record. It's not an intelligence briefing. It's a story about allegations, about disputed claims, about rumor culture, power, and the psychology of belief, and about why certain whispers grow louder the more they're ignored. Because every time an institution refuses to deny something, the internet fills in the blanks. And sometimes, the blanks become more powerful than the truth. This is where the name Ghislaine Maxwell enters the conversation. Not as a hero, not as a reliable narrator, but as a symbol of proximity to power, a symbol of access, a symbol of the kind of social orbit where information doesn't travel in press releases. It travels in murmurs, dinner tables, private lounges, yachts, drawing rooms where last names matter more than first names. And it's from that world, according to various secondhand accounts and unverified claims, that a rumor emerged. A rumor that refuses to die. That certain institutions knew more than they ever acknowledged. That certain decisions were made with more context than the public will ever see. And that a deeply personal narrative, one that should have remained private, somehow became part of whispered speculation. Now pause for a moment. Ask yourself this honestly. Why do rumors involving intelligence agencies spread faster than almost anything else? Because intelligence agencies represent the ultimate unknown. You never see them working. You never hear them speak. And when they stay silent, it doesn't feel neutral. It feels intentional. That's why the mere mention of MI5 changes the temperature of any conversation. MI5 doesn't confirm. MI5 doesn't deny. MI5 doesn't correct TikTok threads or Reddit theories. And that silence, deserved or not, becomes a canvas. People project onto it. Fear, distrust, suspicion. And once suspicion takes hold, facts struggle to catch up. Which brings us to Meghan Markle, a figure whose public image has been argued over, dissected, defended, and attacked more than almost any other modern public figure. To some, she represents disruption. To others, ambition. To others, victimhood. To others, manipulation. And that alone should tell you something. Because when a single person becomes a Rorschach test for millions, the truth often gets buried beneath perception. Before the titles, before the palace, before the global stage, there was a private individual navigating fame, identity, and reinvention in a world that rewards narrative control. And here's where the story begins to fracture. According to unverified claims attributed to Maxwell through intermediaries, claims that remain disputed, undocumented, and impossible to independently verify, intelligence agencies allegedly took interest earlier than the public ever realized. Not because of scandal, not because of crime, but because institutions obsessed with stability don't wait for problems to explode. They map risk. And risk, in intelligence terms, doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means leverage. It means unpredictability. It means pressure points. Now ask yourself another uncomfortable question. If an institution exists to protect continuity, what would it consider a vulnerability? Not morality, not popularity, but anything that could be weaponized by someone else. That's how rumors gain traction. Because they don't have to be true, they only have to be believed by the wrong person at the wrong time. And this is where one of the most sensitive allegations emerges. A claim involving a deeply personal medical decision. One that, if real, would be nobody's business except the individual's. There is no evidence, no documentation, no confirmation, just whispers. And yet those whispers are repeated endlessly online. Why? Because they tap into something darker than curiosity. They tap into the fear that nothing about powerful figures is truly private. That even the most intimate aspects of a person's life can be reduced to strategy discussions and risk assessments. And here's the contradiction that keeps people stuck. On one hand, we say medical privacy is sacred. On the other hand, we consume rumors about it like entertainment. We condemn intrusion, then reward it with clicks. So when an allegation suggests that intelligence agencies knew something deeply personal, even without proof, it triggers outrage and fascination at the same time. Outrage at the violation, fascination with the implication. And that's why these stories persist. Not because they're proven, but because they feel plausible in a world where surveillance is assumed and transparency is rare. Maxwell's alleged role in spreading or repeating such claims, again, always secondhand, always disputed, adds fuel to the fire because of who she was adjacent to. People don't trust her, but they fear what she might have overheard. And fear doesn't need evidence. It needs imagination. Now consider this. If none of these claims are true, if there was no file, no concern, no internal discussion, why has there never been a clean, simple dismissal? Why does the silence continue? Is it legal strategy? Is it institutional habit? Or is it simply that responding would legitimize something too ridiculous to engage with? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Silence works until it doesn't, because silence creates space. And into that space rush influencers, anonymous sources, dramatized YouTube videos, and algorithm-driven speculation, each adding a new detail, each raising the stakes, each convincing someone, somewhere, that smoke must mean fire. And once belief sets in, denial feels suspicious. This is the paradox of modern power. The more authority you have, the less you can explain, which leaves the public to explain it for you. So what are we really examining in this series? Not whether these allegations are true, but why they resonate, why people want them to be true, why others want them erased, and why institutions built on secrecy struggle in an age addicted to exposure. Because the real damage isn't done by the rumor itself. It's done by the uncertainty it creates. Uncertainty erodes trust. Uncertainty polarizes audiences. Uncertainty turns individuals into symbols instead of humans. And that's exactly where this story is headed. Because according to those who claim to have heard Maxwell speak, again, always indirectly, the most unsettling part wasn't what she allegedly said. It was what she implied others already knew. And that implication changes everything. Because if institutions knew something, anything, and still allowed events to unfold, then the story isn't about a person. It's about a system. And systems don't feel guilt. They feel pressure. So as we move forward, remember this. Every claim you'll hear is contested. Every allegation is disputed. Every silence is open to interpretation. But the consequences of believing or dismissing these stories are very real. Reputations are shaped by them. Institutions are judged by them. And the public is left wondering who controls the narrative when truth and rumor collide. Because the next question isn't what was known. It's who decided it didn't matter. And according to the whispers that follow us into the next chapter, someone made that call. And once they did, there was no going back. Why does one name still make powerful people tense up years later? Not because of what she proved, not because of what she was convicted of, but because of what people believe she might know. That's the uncomfortable starting point. Every era has a figure like this. Someone who becomes a container for collective suspicion. Someone whose proximity to power turns into mythology the moment the doors close. And in this story, that figure is Ghislaine Maxwell. Not because she was the most powerful person in the room, but because she was often in the room. And sometimes, that's more dangerous. Here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this entire saga. People say they don't trust her. They call her unreliable, self-serving, manipulative. And yet, when rumors surface that allegedly trace back to her orbit, people lean in. Why? Because even unreliable narrators can overhear real conversations. Because lies can still brush up against truth. And because power doesn't speak loudly when it's relaxed. It whispers. To understand why her name keeps resurfacing, you have to understand the world she moved through. This wasn't just wealth. It wasn't just status. It was access. access to people who didn't put their names on calendars, access to conversations that were never meant to leave the room, access to informal networks where influence moved faster than any official channel. This is where intelligence, media, money, and politics blur. Not in secret basements, not in spy movie theatrics, but over wine, over jokes, over half-finished sentences. And here's the part people struggle with. You don't have to be an intelligence officer to gather intelligence. You just have to be invited. That's why Maxwell has been described, by critics and observers alike, as something more unsettling than a mastermind. A facilitator, a connector, someone who understood which people should meet, and which people should never be seen together. And when someone like that is removed from public life, the questions don't disappear. They multiply, because silence invites imagination. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Is there evidence that she had secret intelligence files? No. Is there proof she worked for any agency? No. Is there documentation that she formally briefed anyone? None that's public. And yet the rumors persist. Why? Because intelligence doesn't only travel in folders. It travels socially. It travels through trust, through repeated exposure, through patterns. People talk around people they believe are safe. And Maxwell was seen, rightly or wrongly, as safe. Until she wasn't. So when second-hand accounts began circulating, especially after her arrest, claiming she spoke about who knew what and when, it didn't matter whether those accounts were true. They fit a narrative people were already primed to believe. That powerful institutions always know more than they admit, and that they sometimes choose silence over intervention. Now pause and ask yourself something. If an intelligence agency wanted to monitor risk around a major public institution, would they announce it? Would they issue statements? Or would they do what intelligence agencies always do? Watch quietly. That's the fear embedded in these rumors. Not that something illegal happened, but that something was known. And knowing, without acting, feels like complicity to the public. This is where the story becomes less about any one person and more about systems. Because systems don't behave emotionally. They behave strategically, and strategy often looks cold from the outside. According to disputed claims attributed indirectly to Maxwell, she allegedly suggested that interest from British intelligence circles predated public awareness. Again, no proof. But the claim itself has gravity because of what it implies. That relationships are assessed. That backgrounds are evaluated. That narratives are weighed. Not for morality, for stability. And stability is the currency of institutions like monarchies. Here's the uncomfortable historical context most people forget. Royal households have been monitored, advised, and quietly assessed for decades. Not because royals are criminals, but because they are symbols. Symbols attract leverage attempts. Symbols attract foreign interest. Symbols attract pressure. So when rumors suggest that someone entering that world drew attention early, people don't immediately dismiss it. They ask why, and that's where speculation fills the gap. Maxwell's alleged comments, again, always filtered through intermediaries, never on record, painted a picture of awareness without interference, of observation without obstruction, of files that existed simply because that's what institutions do. And here's where the narrative becomes dangerous. Because once people believe an institution knew, every subsequent event is reinterpreted. Decisions become suspect. Silence becomes strategic. Support becomes endorsement. And suddenly, a personal story becomes a geopolitical chessboard. This is the trap of conspiracy thinking. It reorders time. It turns coincidence into intention. And it places people into roles they never consented to play. Maxwell's notoriety amplifies this effect because of her past proximity to scandal. People assume she saw everything, heard everything, understood everything. But proximity is not omniscience. And that's where belief outruns reality. Now consider the psychology of why her alleged whispers carry weight. She is disgraced. She is imprisoned. She has nothing to lose. That makes her, in the public imagination, dangerous. And dangerous people are assumed to tell the truth out of spite, whether they do or not. But here's the contradiction most people ignore. People with nothing to lose also have nothing compelling them to be careful. They can exaggerate. They can dramatize. They can provoke. And audiences often confuse provocation with revelation. So when claims surface that she allegedly referenced intelligence awareness or hinted at early concerns, It's impossible to know whether that was information or performance. And yet, the damage is the same. Because once the idea is planted, it doesn't need confirmation. It needs repetition. Online forums pick it up. Commentators amplify it. Videos reframe it. And soon, a question becomes a why. A why becomes an of course. And an of course becomes accepted lore. This is how modern myths are born. Not through evidence, but through unresolved tension. And Maxwell's story is nothing but unresolved tension. Now let's connect this back to the larger theme. Why does this matter to the monarchy? Because monarchies survive on legitimacy. Legitimacy depends on trust. And trust erodes when people believe decisions were made behind closed doors with information they were never meant to have. Whether that belief is justified doesn't change its impact. Public confidence doesn't ask for footnotes. It asks for reassurance. And reassurance has been in short supply. Every refusal to comment, every no response, every closed briefing, it all reinforces the same suspicion, that there is more to know. And Maxwell's shadow looms over that suspicion because she represents the opposite of transparency. A world where everything is hinted at and nothing is confirmed. A world where implication is currency. So what do we actually know? We know she moved in elite circles. We know she facilitated connections. We know she is now widely distrusted. We know intelligence agencies do not discuss their internal assessments. And we know that rumors thrive where silence persists. Everything else sits in the gray zone. But the gray zone is where audiences linger. Because gray zones feel honest. They reflect uncertainty. And uncertainty is more relatable than certainty in a world where institutions rarely explain themselves. Here's the most important question to ask as we move forward. Even if every alleged comment attributed to Maxwell is false, why do people believe them? Why does the idea of intelligence awareness feel plausible? Why does silence feel louder than denial? And why does this story refuse to die? The answer may have less to do with Maxwell herself and more to do with a public that no longer trusts official narratives to tell the whole story. Because once trust is broken, rumors don't need proof. They need plausibility. And in the next chapter, we're going to examine that plausibility. Not through names, not through accusations, but through how intelligence agencies actually decide what matters, how they categorize risk, and why interest doesn't mean intervention. Because according to those same disputed whispers, there was a moment when watching turned into waiting, and that waiting would have consequences no one anticipated. But what came next would change how this story is told forever, what actually triggers the attention of an intelligence agency. Not headlines, not gossip, not outrage trending on social media. Those things come later. Real intelligence work begins long before the public ever notices anything at all. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because most people imagine intelligence agencies as reactive. They think something bad happens, and then the agencies move in. That's not how it works. They anticipate. They assess. They quietly observe patterns that most people don't even know exist. Which brings us back to the question left hanging at the end of the last chapter. If watching is routine, when does watching become concern? And more importantly, who decides? Let's strip away the drama for a moment and talk about mechanics. Intelligence agencies like MI5 don't operate on morality or public opinion. They operate on risk frameworks. Risk doesn't mean someone is bad. It doesn't mean someone is guilty. It doesn't even mean someone has done anything wrong. Risk means unpredictability. Risk means exposure. Risk means leverage. And leverage is the word that makes people uneasy. Because leverage doesn't require wrongdoing. It only requires vulnerability. Now ask yourself this. If an individual is on the path toward one of the most symbolically powerful institutions in the world, would intelligence agencies wait until that transition is complete to start paying attention? Or would they quietly map the terrain beforehand? History gives us the answer. They never wait. They never have. Royal households have always existed alongside intelligence services, not because royals are criminals, but because they are targets. Targets for influence. Targets for coercion. Targets for foreign interest. So when disputed claims circulate suggesting that intelligence interest existed before the public narrative fully formed, the idea doesn't sound impossible. It sounds procedural, and that's what unsettles people. Because procedure feels impersonal. It suggests that lives can be. This is why intelligence agencies rarely comment on speculation. Engaging legitimizes it, but ignoring it allows it to grow. It's a lose-lose equation. And the longer silence persists, the more elaborate the theories become. People begin connecting dots that were never meant to touch. They reinterpret past events through new lenses. They search for meaning where there may be none. This is how ordinary procedural awareness turns into perceived conspiracy. And once that happens, there's no easy reset. Now here's the twist most people miss. Intelligence agencies don't think in terms of individuals. They think in terms of systems. They don't ask, is this person good or bad? They ask, does this scenario create instability? And instability isn't always visible right away. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it only becomes obvious after public trust has already fractured. That's when people look back and say, someone should have done something. But hindsight always overestimates foresight. So where does that leave us? With a fog made of silence, speculation, and secondhand claims. A fog that Maxwell's alleged remarks drift through without ever solidifying. And in that fog, one idea keeps surfacing. That watching turned into waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for outcomes. Waiting to see if concern was warranted. And waiting is the most dangerous posture of all, because waiting creates distance. Distance between decision-makers and consequences. Distance between knowledge and responsibility. And if the whispers are to be believed, and that's a big if, that waiting shaped everything that came after. But here's the question we haven't asked yet. What happens when intelligence agencies stop watching, and something slips through the cracks? Because in the next chapter, we're going to step away from institutions and look at the person at the center of all this speculation. Not as a symbol, not as a narrative, but as a constructed public identity, and how perception itself can become a form of power or vulnerability. Because once an identity hardens in the public imagination, no amount of silence can undo it. And according to the whispers that follow us forward, by the time the world was watching, it may have already been too late. Who decides who someone was before the world decided who they are now? That's the question that quietly haunts every public figure who undergoes a sudden transformation. And it's the question that matters most when speculation collides with power. Before the titles, before the protocols, before the global fascination and the backlash that followed, there was a woman navigating an industry built on reinvention. And reinvention, when viewed through the wrong lens, can look like secrecy. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like admitting. Public identities are constructed, not fabricated, constructed, through repetition, through selective storytelling, through emphasis and omission. Hollywood runs on this principle. Politics does too. And royal institutions, despite their traditions, are not immune. So when whispers suggest that intelligence agencies noticed a trajectory early, it's essential to separate mythology from mechanics. Because watching a trajectory is not the same as judging a person. And yet, in rumor culture, those two ideas blur instantly. Let's talk about trajectory. Before becoming a royal figure, Meghan Markle existed in a space many people misunderstand. Not fame, not obscurity, but the in-between. The zone where ambition meets opportunity, where networking matters, where public image is fluid rather than fixed. This is a world where people are encouraged to reframe their story, to emphasize certain chapters, to downplay others, to present a version that aligns with where they're trying to go. That's not deception, that's survival. And yet, to institutions obsessed with predictability, fluidity itself can look like risk. Here's the contradiction. Audiences celebrate reinvention when it leads to success. Institutions become cautious when reinvention happens quickly. Because speed raises questions, not accusations. Questions. Where did this momentum come from? Who enabled it? What networks facilitated it? These are standard questions in any risk assessment environment. They're not moral judgments. They're mapping exercises. Now consider how this intersects with public perception. Once someone becomes globally visible, their past is reinterpreted. Old interviews are rewatched. Photos are recontextualized. Decisions are scrutinized with hindsight. And hindsight is brutal. It turns ordinary career moves into signals. It turns coincidence into pattern. It turns privacy into mystery. This is where rumor culture takes over. Because when people don't have access to complete information, they fill gaps with speculation. And speculation spreads fastest when it feels explanatory. According to disputed claims attributed indirectly to Maxwell, early interest wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about narrative consistency. Again, unverified. Again, contested. But the idea resonates because institutions care deeply about narrative alignment, especially institutions built on continuity. A monarchy doesn't just manage people. It manages symbolism. And symbolism thrives on clarity. When a public figure's identity is still evolving, clarity is harder to pin down. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is unfinished. Now here's where the story becomes emotionally charged. Public audiences often confuse privacy with concealment. They assume that if something wasn't widely discussed, it must have been hidden. But private lives are not case files. They're fragmented by nature. Most people's stories only become coherent after the fact, when someone else tells them. And when those stories are told by critics rather than the subject, they skew. This is how allegations gain traction. Not through proof, but through reinterpretation. A career choice becomes a motive. A social circle becomes a network. A personal boundary becomes suspicion. And once suspicion attaches itself to a public figure, it's hard to shake. Because suspicion doesn't require resolution. It feeds on ambiguity. This is where intelligence speculation intersects dangerously with celebrity culture. Intelligence agencies value predictability. Celebrity culture rewards reinvention. Those values clash. So when whispers suggest that intelligence assessments existed, people imagine dossiers filled with secrets. In reality, assessments are often banal. Background summaries. Publicly available information. Association mapping. Nothing scandalous. But rumor culture doesn't thrive on the banal. It thrives on implication. Now consider the role of media. Media doesn't create identities, it amplifies them. It chooses which version of a person to spotlight. And once a version becomes dominant, alternatives are treated as suspicious. This is how a public figure becomes trapped in expectation. Damned if they change. Damned if they don't. Every action is interpreted through the dominant narrative. And narratives, once established, are resistant to correction. So when disputed claims suggest that intelligence agencies were aware early on, the public doesn't ask what that awareness contained. They assume depth. They assume secrets. Because that's more emotionally satisfying than procedural mundanity. Now let's pause and ask a harder question. What if there was nothing remarkable to know? What if early attention, if it existed at all, was no different from the attention given to countless others entering high-profile spaces? What if the story only became extraordinary because of what happened later? This possibility rarely satisfies audiences, because it denies drama. And drama is what keeps speculation alive. Here's another contradiction worth confronting. Audiences demand privacy, but punish opacity. They insist on boundaries, but reward exposure. They condemn rumor, but circulate it endlessly. Public figures exist inside this contradiction every day. And when intelligence agencies are added to the mix, the contradiction explodes. Because intelligence agencies symbolize ultimate knowledge. So people assume they know everything. And if they know everything, then silence must mean approval, or fear, or complicity. This is a false binary. Silence can also mean irrelevance. But irrelevance is never the conclusion people want. Now consider how all of this reframes the alleged whispers attributed to Maxwell. Her supposed comments didn't need to provide evidence. They needed to suggest that someone, somewhere, had already connected the dots. Because once dots are imagined, audiences will connect them themselves. And they will connect them in ways that reflect their existing beliefs. Those who distrust institutions will see cover-up. Those who distrust the subject will see validation. Those caught in between will feel uneasy and keep watching. That's the power of ambiguity. And ambiguity is the engine of this entire story. Which brings us back to the core issue. This chapter isn't about what intelligence agencies knew. It's about how identities are constructed and reconstructed once power enters the frame. Before the palace, there was motion. Career motion. Social motion. Narrative motion. Motion is normal. But motion looks suspicious when frozen and analyzed frame by frame. That's what the internet does best. It freezes time. And once frozen, everything looks deliberate. Now here's the emotional beat most people miss. Behind every public identity is a person experiencing events in real time. They don't know how their story will end. They don't know which moments will be weaponized later. They don't know which silences will be interpreted as secrets. They're living forward while the world judges backward. That asymmetry is cruel. And it's intensified when intelligent speculation enters the conversation. Because intelligence explains everything, until it explains nothing. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. This story is not about certainty. It's about how uncertainty spreads, how narratives harden, how institutions, by refusing to comment, allow speculation to metastasize, and how individuals become symbols whether they want to or not. Because in the next chapter, the story takes its most sensitive turn, not into proof, not into confirmation, but into the ethics of rumor itself. Why some claims should never have been repeated, why privacy becomes collateral damage, and why even false stories can cause real harm. And according to the whispers that continue to circulate, that line may have already been crossed. What happens when the most private part of a person's life becomes the most repeated rumor about them? Not whispered in confidence, not handled with care, but debated, dissected, and recycled by people who will never know the truth. This is the chapter where curiosity turns uncomfortable, because this is where speculation stops being abstract and starts feeling invasive. And it begins with a claim that should never have become public conversation at all. A claim about a medical decision. A claim about a body. A claim about autonomy. A claim that has never been proven, never documented, and never confirmed, and yet refuses to disappear. Why? Because it fits too neatly into the story people think they already understand. And once a rumor feels explanatory, ethics often comes second. Let's slow this down. No matter who the person is, no matter how famous, no matter how polarizing, medical information is private. Full stop. And yet, in the ecosystem of online speculation, privacy becomes negotiable the moment it's framed as relevance. People tell themselves it matters because of succession, because of optics, because of symbolism. They tell themselves it's not gossip, it's context. But context doesn't justify violation. And this is where the line blurs dangerously. According to disputed, secondhand claims attributed to Maxwell through intermediaries, always indirectly, never on record. A deeply personal medical narrative was allegedly known within elite circles long before it ever appeared online. Again, there is no proof, no documentation, no verification, just repetition. And repetition is powerful, because the more something is repeated, the more familiar it feels. And familiarity often masquerades as truth. Here's the contradiction that makes this rumor persist. On one hand, people insist intelligence agencies monitor risk, not morality. On the other hand, they assume medical information would be treated as strategic intelligence. That assumption reveals more about public anxiety than institutional behavior. Because intelligence agencies do not, and cannot, traffic in personal medical gossip as a matter of routine. But rumor culture doesn't care about routine. It cares about shock. And nothing shocks like the idea that something deeply personal was allegedly known, discussed, or weighed by people in power. That idea triggers outrage. Outrage fuels engagement. Engagement fuels algorithms. And algorithms do not have ethics. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why does this particular allegation attract so much attention? Not because it's verified, but because it challenges a narrative people hold dear. The fairy tale, the continuity, the expectation. When reality deviates from expectation, people search for explanations. And when explanations aren't available, they invent them. This is not new. History is full of powerful women whose bodies became public property the moment they stepped into symbolic roles. Their fertility, their health, their choices, all scrutinized as if they belong to the institution rather than the individual. That scrutiny is cruel, and it's normalized. So when this allegation surfaces, many don't question whether it should be discussed. They ask whether it's true. That's the problem. Because even asking legitimizes intrusion. And once intrusion is legitimized, boundaries collapse. Now let's talk about how this rumor is framed. Rarely as a standalone claim. Almost always as a piece of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that implies foresight. A puzzle that implies knowledge. A puzzle that implies strategy. That framing is seductive. It turns gossip into narrative. And narratives are easier to believe than isolated facts, especially when they're delivered with confidence. especially when they're attributed to someone perceived as an insider, even a disgraced one. This is why Maxwell's alleged role, again, always indirect, matters in perception, not proof. She symbolizes proximity. And proximity, in the public imagination, equals access. But access does not equal accuracy, and that distinction is lost online. Now consider the ethical collapse that follows. Once a rumor is framed as intelligence adjacent, people feel permitted to repeat it. They tell themselves it's already out there. They tell themselves they're just discussing implications. They tell themselves the subject is powerful enough to withstand it. This is how harm is rationalized. This is how privacy is eroded without anyone feeling responsible. And the damage isn't hypothetical. Even false claims leave residue. They alter how someone is perceived. They change how audiences interpret their actions. They infect unrelated discussions with suspicion. Once a rumor touches something as intimate as medical autonomy, it stains everything around it. And here's the cruel irony. The people repeating the rumor often claim to care about agency. They frame it as empowerment, as transparency, as truth-seeking. But empowerment doesn't require exposure. And truth-seeking doesn't justify violation. So why doesn't this rumor die? Because it serves too many agendas. For critics, it reinforces distrust. For conspiracists, it confirms hidden knowledge. For algorithms, it drives engagement. And for institutions, responding would amplify it. So silence continues. And silence, again, becomes misinterpreted. People assume silence means discomfort, or fear, or confirmation. Rarely do they consider the simplest explanation, that engaging would dignify a claim that should never have existed. This is the trap of modern discourse. Refusal to comment is read as strategy rather than restraint. Now let's return to the intelligence angle, carefully. Even if, hypothetically, intelligence agencies were aware of a personal medical choice, which remains unproven, awareness does not equal relevance. Agencies triage information constantly. Most data is irrelevant. Most details never rise beyond cursory awareness. But rumor culture compresses everything into significance. It assumes that if something was known, it must have mattered. That assumption is emotionally satisfying, but operationally false. Institutions are not omniscient storytellers. They are bureaucracies. And bureaucracies are messy, fragmented, and often uninterested in personal narratives. So where does that leave this claim? In a limbo, unprovable, unethical, and yet endlessly repeated. Which raises a deeper question. Why do audiences crave explanations that reduce people to functions? Why is it comforting to believe that every outcome was predetermined by hidden knowledge? Because randomness is unsettling. Because human choice is messy. Because admitting that things unfolded without grand design makes the world feel less controllable. So conspiracy fills the gap. It offers coherence, even if that coherence comes at the cost of someone's dignity. This is the cost of rumor culture. It doesn't need villains. It doesn't need proof. It only needs a story that feels like it explains too much to ignore. And once that story takes hold, correcting it becomes almost impossible. Because corrections are boring. Corrections don't spread. Corrections don't satisfy curiosity. They end it. So what do institutions do? They wait. They hope the cycle moves on. They hope attention shifts. They hope fatigue sets in. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, rumors calcify into common knowledge. Not because they're true, but because they were never challenged loudly enough. This is the moral failure of the attention economy. It rewards harm over restraint. It elevates speculation over evidence. And it turns human bodies into narrative devices. So as we move forward, keep this boundary in mind. This story is not about confirming any medical claim. It's about examining why such claims are made, repeated, and believed. It's about how privacy erodes when power enters the frame. And it's about how institutions, by doing nothing, can unintentionally feed the very narratives they wish would disappear. Because in the next chapter, we're going to ask a question that makes everyone uncomfortable. If intelligence agencies don't care about morality, what do they actually care about? And how do they decide when something crosses the line from irrelevant to risky? Because according to the whispers that follow us onward, that calculation may have already been made. And once it was made, everything else became inevitable. If intelligence agencies don't police morality, then what exactly do they care about? That question makes people uneasy because it strips away the comforting idea that someone, somewhere, is guarding values. They're not. They're guarding stability. And stability is colder than morality ever will be. Here's the provocative truth most people avoid. Intelligence agencies are not interested in whether something is right or wrong. They're interested. Now let's address the silence that fuels all of this. Why don't intelligence agencies step in and say, "We assessed this and found nothing of concern"? Because doing so would create precedent. It would invite endless demands for disclosure. It would turn intelligence work into public performance. That's not how these institutions survive. They survive by refusing to be drawn into narrative battles. But in the age of constant content, that refusal is misread. Silence is assumed to hide something. But often, silence hides nothing more than routine. Routine is boring. Routine doesn't go viral. So rumor replaces routine. Now think about the cost-benefit calculation. If an agency responds to every rumor, it legitimizes them. If it responds to none, it allows them to grow. There is no perfect response. So agencies choose the option that protects long-term credibility among allies and internal partners, not the public. Because intelligence agencies don't exist to reassure audiences. They exist to manage threats. And threats are not always visible to the public. This is where the public and institutional perspectives collide. The public wants explanation. Institutions want containment. Those goals are incompatible, which is why speculation thrives. Now let's return to the whispers attributed indirectly to Maxwell. Her alleged implication wasn't that intelligence agencies intervened. It was that they were aware. That subtlety matters, because awareness does not imply action. And action is constrained by law, protocol, and political reality. Intelligence agencies cannot override personal autonomy. They cannot veto relationships. They cannot dictate outcomes simply because something might be awkward later. That would be authoritarian. So even if awareness existed, action may never have been an option. This is the part that rarely gets discussed. People imagine intelligence agencies as all-powerful. They're not. They advise. They assess. They recommend. And then others decide. Those decisions are shaped by politics, optics, and tradition, which means intelligence input can be ignored, or deprioritized, or filed away. And when outcomes later become controversial, the myth of omniscience kicks in. People assume someone must have known better. Someone must have warned. Someone must have failed. This is hindsight projection. It assigns blame retroactively to systems that operate under uncertainty. Now here's the emotional pivot. For audiences already skeptical of institutions, the idea that agencies knew and didn't act feels like betrayal. For audiences skeptical of individuals, it feels like validation. Both reactions are driven by identity, not evidence. And identity shapes belief. That's why this story polarizes so deeply, because it allows everyone to see what they already expect to see. Corruption, cover-up, negligence, or, alternatively, restraint, procedure, limits of power. The same silence supports all interpretations, and that ambiguity is unbearable to people who want resolution. But intelligence work rarely offers resolution. It offers probability, and probability is unsatisfying. So rumor steps in and offers certainty. False certainty, perhaps, but certainty nonetheless. Now let's ask the question that rarely gets asked. What if intelligence agencies did everything they were supposed to do? What if they assessed risk, shared findings internally, and then stepped back because there was no actionable threat? What if the chaos that followed was not a failure of intelligence, but a consequence of human choice and public reaction? That possibility is deeply unsettling, because it means there's no villain, no mastermind, no hidden hand, just systems colliding with personalities. And audiences hate that explanation, because it denies the drama they've been promised. So instead, they cling to the idea that someone knew something crucial, that someone chose silence over intervention, that someone prioritized image over truth. And once that belief takes root, no amount of clarification will uproot it, because belief is emotional, evidence is rational, and emotion travels faster. So as we move forward, understand this. This chapter is not about proving intelligence involvement. It's about understanding why the idea of intelligence involvement feels compelling, why it satisfies a psychological need, and why it persists even in the absence of proof. Because in the next chapter, the story shifts again, away from institutions, away from speculation, and toward the moment when private assessments, real or imagined, collided with public reality. The moment when watching ended and consequences began. And according to the whispers that continue to circulate, that moment came sooner than anyone expected. What happens when caution meets conviction? Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that happens behind closed doors, where advice is offered carefully and decisions are made politely. This is the chapter where the story stops being theoretical, because this is where observation, real or imagined, collides with will. And will, once engaged, is very hard to redirect. Here's the uncomfortable reality most people don't want to accept. Institutions can advise. They can assess. They can warn in measured language. But they cannot choose for people. And when personal conviction outruns institutional caution, the system reveals its limits. That's the blind spot. Not ignorance, not malice, but restraint. Royal systems are designed to endure, not to control every outcome. They function on precedent, protocol, and deference. Deference to tradition. Deference to autonomy. Deference to the idea that personal choice, once made, must be accommodated. This is where the mythology of omnipotent institutions collapses, because monarchies, despite appearances, are reactive systems. They absorb shock. They adapt slowly. They rarely preempt with force. And when they do intervene forcefully, history remembers it badly. So when speculation suggests that warnings existed, again, hypothetical, unverified, and often exaggerated, the public imagines dramatic confrontations, ultimatums, secret meetings, red lines. Reality is far less cinematic. Advice is couched in concern. Concerns are couched in neutrality. Neutrality is mistaken for approval. And once approval is assumed, momentum takes over. Momentum is the most powerful force in any institution, because stopping momentum requires certainty, and certainty is rare. Now consider the timeline. At the moment when private awareness, if it existed, would have mattered most, everything was still forming. Public perception wasn't fixed. Outcomes weren't predetermined. There was still plausible deniability. This is when institutions often choose patience over panic. They wait to see how things settle. They hope for normalization. They assume friction will resolve itself. That assumption is not reckless. It's institutional instinct. Because most controversies fade. Most narratives soften. Most transitions stabilize. But some don't. And when they don't, the cost of early restraint becomes visible too late. This is the paradox of institutional wisdom. What protects stability in most cases can look like failure in the exceptional ones. And exceptional cases are the ones people remember. Now let's talk about perception. Once a relationship becomes public, scrutiny intensifies exponentially. Every gesture is analyzed. Every silence is interrogated. Every expression is read as strategy. At that point, internal advice loses power. Because the narrative is no longer internal. It belongs to the public. And public narratives are not governed by reason. They're governed by emotion. So even if caution existed behind the scenes, it would have been drowned out by spectacle, ceremony, pageantry, symbolism. Once the public invests emotionally, reversing course becomes nearly impossible, because reversal looks like rejection, and rejection looks cruel. Royal systems are acutely aware of that optics. They know intervention can backfire, so they tread carefully. Too carefully, some would argue. And this is where the idea of a blind spot emerges. Not a lack of information, but a miscalculation of consequence. The assumption that time would smooth tension, that public affection would stabilize perception, that adaptation would absorb disruption. Those assumptions are not irrational. They're historically grounded. But history doesn't repeat perfectly, and modern media accelerates everything. What once took years now takes weeks. Outrage cycles spin faster. Polarization hardens quicker. Narratives calcify before institutions can respond. This is where speculation about intelligence awareness becomes emotionally charged, because people assume awareness should equal intervention. But intervention is constrained by legitimacy. Royal institutions cannot appear coercive. They cannot override personal agency without undermining their own moral authority. So even if concern existed, action would have been limited. and limited action feels like no action at all to the public. Now here's the contradiction that fuels resentment. When institutions do nothing, they're accused of negligence. When they intervene, they're accused of control. There is no scenario where everyone feels satisfied. And in that tension, rumor thrives. Now think about the idea of a blind spot more carefully. Blind spots are not areas of ignorance. They're areas of assumed safety, places where risk is underestimated because precedent suggests it will resolve itself. In this story, the assumed safety was normalization, the belief that integration would settle controversy. That difference would become accepted. That initial friction would fade into routine. Those beliefs were not malicious. They were hopeful. But hope is not a strategy. And hope doesn't account for amplification. Modern amplification turns every misstep into a referendum. And once public trust fractures, repair becomes exponentially harder. This is where the cost of waiting reveals itself. Not in the moment, but later, when narratives harden, when sides form, when every silence is interpreted as intent. And by then, it's too late for gentle course correction. This is the point where people begin to ask dangerous questions. Who should have stepped in? Who should have said something? Who bears responsibility? Those questions assume there was a clear moment to intervene. Often, there wasn't. Just a series of small decisions that felt reasonable at the time. Reasonable decisions that, in aggregate, produced unexpected outcomes. That's how institutions fail without anyone intending failure. Now let's bring this back to the rumors. The idea that intelligence agencies knew and still allowed things to unfold feeds into the narrative of institutional blindness. It suggests foresight without courage, knowledge without accountability. But this interpretation ignores constraints: legal, cultural, symbolic. Intelligence agencies do not dictate royal choices. They inform, and being informed does not obligate action. This is the nuance that gets lost online. Nuance does not survive virality. So instead, the story simplifies. Someone knew. Someone ignored it. Everything else followed. It's a satisfying arc, but it's also incomplete. Because it removes human agency from the center of the story. It turns people into pawns. And pawns are easier to judge than complex actors navigating unprecedented situations. Now consider the emotional toll of this blind spot. Not on institutions, on individuals. Living inside an escalating narrative you no longer control. Watching your story be rewritten by people who've never met you. Feeling decisions harden around you like concrete. This is where sympathy fractures. Some feel empathy. Others feel vindication. And the institution, caught in the middle, retreats further into silence. Silence becomes armor. But armor also creates distance. And distance fuels alienation. This is the spiral. The more controversy grows, the less institutions say. The less they say, the more speculation fills the gap. The more speculation grows, the harder it becomes to intervene. Eventually, every option looks like loss. That's the real blind spot. The belief that restraint would preserve harmony. When in fact, restraint allowed polarization to entrench itself. Now here's the question that leads us forward. If this was the blind spot, the moment when caution failed to anticipate amplification, what happened when the private sphere finally collapsed into public confrontation? Because there is always a breaking point. A moment when internal management gives way to open fracture. And according to the whispers and reconstructions that circulate now, that moment didn't arrive quietly. It arrived with cameras, with statements, with a narrative that could no longer be contained. And once it surfaced, everything changed. Because in the next chapter, we're going to examine how media didn't just report the story. It reshaped it. How coverage didn't just reflect tension. It intensified it. And how the story stopped being about decisions and became about sides. Because once sides form, there is no return to neutrality. And according to those watching closely, that was the moment the story escaped the institution's control entirely. Who actually tells the story when everyone is watching? Not the institution, not the subject, not even the journalists who think they're reporting it. The story is told by momentum. And momentum, once it takes hold, doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about amplification. This is the chapter where everything accelerates. Because this is where a private narrative, shaped by silence, speculation, and restraint, collides with a media ecosystem that thrives on conflict. And once that collision happens, no one fully controls what comes next. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Media doesn't simply reflect reality. It selects it, frames it, repeats it, rewards certain angles until they harden into consensus. That doesn't require conspiracy. It requires incentives. Clicks, ratings, engagement. Outrage performs better than nuance. Certainty performs better than ambiguity. And victims and villains perform better than complexity. So when a story emerges that contains all three ingredients, power, secrecy, and emotional stakes, it doesn't just get reported. It gets sculpted. Now think back to the early days of this narrative. Coverage wasn't uniform. Some outlets leaned into celebration. Others leaned into skepticism. Others leaned into cultural conflict. Each approach attracted a different audience. And once audiences aligned themselves emotionally, coverage followed them. This is feedback loop journalism. The media learns what its audience wants to feel and gives it to them. Not because journalists are malicious, but because institutions adapt to survive. And survival in modern media means attention. This is where the line between accident and design blurs. Because no one needs to coordinate for an outcome to emerge. Patterns arise organically when incentives align. Stories that provoke outrage get more airtime. Stories that complicate outrage get sidelined. Over time, the dominant narrative crowds out alternatives. And once that happens, correction becomes nearly impossible. Now add intelligent speculation into this environment. Whispers about awareness. Hints of knowledge. Silences interpreted as strategy. These elements are irresistible to media outlets because they elevate the story from celebrity coverage to power analysis. They turn personal choices into institutional drama. And drama scales. Once intelligence-adjacent language enters the frame, everything is reinterpreted. A lack of comment becomes a refusal. A refusal becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes assumed guilt. And the media, caught between skepticism and sensationalism, often drifts toward the latter. Because skepticism requires patience. And patience does not trend. This is where the narrative fractures into camps. One camp sees media as protective. Another sees it as predatory. Both are partially right. Because media is not a monolith. It's an ecosystem. Different actors, different incentives, same amplification machine. Now let's talk about framing. Framing determines what questions audiences ask. Is this a love story or a cautionary tale? Is this empowerment or manipulation? Is this prejudice or accountability? Once a frame takes hold, evidence is filtered through it. Facts that support the frame are elevated. Facts that complicate it are dismissed. This is not unique to this story. It's how human cognition works under pressure. And pressure is what media generates best. Now consider the role of silence again. When institutions refuse to comment, media fills the void. Experts speculate. Former insiders opine. Anonymous sources emerge. Each layer adds authority without adding certainty. And audiences rarely distinguish between them. Speculation, once televised, feels validated. And once validated, it becomes part of the story's DNA. This is how rumors gain legitimacy. Not through proof, but through repetition by credible platforms. Now let's address a difficult question. Was this escalation intentional? Did anyone design this narrative outcome? There is no evidence of coordinated design. But design is not required. Systems produce outcomes. When media incentives align with public emotion, escalation is inevitable. No mastermind needed, just momentum. And momentum feeds on conflict. This is where the idea of sides becomes unavoidable. Audiences don't just consume stories. They inhabit them. They identify with positions. They defend narratives as extensions of their values. And once identity is involved, facts become secondary. Contradictions are ignored. Corrections are rejected. Complexity is resented. This is how coverage stops informing and starts entrenching. Now consider how this affects the individuals at the center of the story. Every interview becomes a test. Every appearance becomes evidence. Every absence becomes suspicious. There is no neutral ground. And the media, in trying to be balanced, often amplifies extremes instead. Because extremes are clearer, they're easier to package. They create the illusion of debate. But debate requires shared facts. And by this point, shared facts are gone. All that remains are interpretations. This is where intelligent speculation becomes especially toxic. Because intelligence implies hidden truth. And hidden truth implies deception. So even benign actions are reframed as strategy. Even emotion is questioned. Is this authentic? Is this calculated? Is this messaging? The media asks these questions not because they know the answers, but because asking keeps audiences engaged. Now here's the irony. The more the media interrogates intention, the less space there is for humanity. People become avatars for ideas. They stop being individuals and start being symbols. And symbols don't get the benefit of the doubt. Symbols are meant to be argued over. This is the stage where polarization hardens, where each side believes the other is either blind or malicious, where nuance is seen as betrayal. And the media, by continuing to platform the most emotionally charged voices, accelerates the divide. Now let's return to the question of accident or design. Was this outcome designed by the media? No. Was it enabled by the media? Absolutely. Because the media did what it always does in moments.